Hey guys, I'm moving the Meritocracy video over to the side channel for two reasons. The first one is, as always, a copyright strike. The second one is because, frankly, it turned out too much like some of Kraut's videos. I like Kraut's stuff, I watch his videos all the time. I generally read the books that he cites whenever he makes a video because it's usually pretty good sources. I explained this on a stream already, but basically, I used the same sources for this video, and it came out way too much like his for my liking. There's no drama or anything, we've already talked it out. I've apologized to him, but I'm just archiving this over here. If you want to watch it though, here it is. Enjoy.
That's a good thing.
Right, but
That's meritocracy.
Depends on your point of view, right?
That's
the
that-
thing.
It's both good and bad.
Aristocracy or
It's
meritocracy?
pretty
Which
quick.
is better?
Pretty quick.
I'm not sure there's a difference, to be honest.
The last time I spoke to Adam Friended and PSA Sitch over on their channel, it was with our mutual friend Sargon, and we had an interesting four-way debate over the concepts of meritocracy and aristocracy. Adam and Sitch, being Americans, have a very American view on that conversation. America was founded after a revolution against a king who they perceived to be a tyrant, and liberal philosophy, being all the rage at the time, became the nation's founding principles. The idea of a landed nobility leading a kingdom and controlling an underclass of serfs was exactly what the Americans rejected, in favor of a republican system where that underclass, now the citizenry, would be politically enfranchised through voting. Rather than the rulers simply ruling the people with divine right, the people would now choose their own rulers in a democratic process. It's through this lens that Adam and Sitch, and most other Americans that I meet, view the word aristocracy. Aristocracy is the idea of an elite class of people who are born into the role and serve in that role as a result of their bloodline, not their ability as a ruler. Meanwhile, meritocracy is the opposite idea, an elite class that serves in that role because they are the best at the job. They are fit to rule by their actions, regardless of their bloodline. Because the founding mythology of America is revolution against a king who lives an ocean away and is totally disconnected from the American people, in the name of individual freedom and democratic enfranchisement, it makes sense that Americans view aristocracy and meritocracy as polar opposites. Rule by blood versus rule by ability, simple as. And this idea, this comparison between the American Republic versus old Europe, is baked into American culture. It's a core component of the American identity. Send those huddled masses yearning to be free to America, where they can be liberated from feudalism. You can tell by the tone in their voice that Americans are proud of this whenever you ask them about it. And though I also personally agree that judging based on merit is the ideal way to choose a leader, obviously, in the conversation with Adam and Sitch, Sargon and I were trying to point out that the dichotomy between aristocracy and meritocracy that Americans cling to is actually a lot more complicated. But because I'm a garbage debater and I do way better after writing my ideas down and reading books, nerd shit, I don't think I describe my ideas as well as I could have. Let's see if I can do a better job of it today. There's a common belief among many Americans that the ruling class of all pre-liberal civilizations were simply aristocrats, the children of kings or emperors or chiefs, and it was English liberalism that ushered in the idea of people not being judged by their parentage but by their behavior. Before this innovation, merit simply wasn't a consideration. The ruling class ruled by birthright. It didn't matter if they were good or bad at the job. It didn't matter if their serfs loved or hated them. It didn't matter if there was some lowly peasant who could have done the job better hypothetically. God says they rule, so they rule. And that was true sometimes, but it wasn't consistently true. In order to show you why, I'm going to be pulling a lot of information from the book Feudal Society by the French historian Marc Bloch. Unlike most academics I talk about on my channel, Bloch's personal history doesn't factor into his writing all that much. He was a French Jew born in 1886. He fought in the First World War, survived and received his doctorate in 1918, beginning a distinguished academic career in European history. He volunteered for service during the Second World War, and after France's surrender, he was one of the only Jews who was permitted to continue working in academia by the German authorities due to his incredible talent. However, he was forced to leave Paris, and Nazi officers looted the belongings he left behind. He continued to teach in Vichy, France until its invasion in 1942. At this point, he joined the French resistance, and continued to fight the Germans underground until his capture and execution in 1944. Feudal Society is primarily a history text, and it's long and boring and dry. I wouldn't actually recommend picking this one up unless you're a history nerd or something. There's a lot of important stuff in here that's relevant to today's topic. For example, did you know that for the majority of Europe's noble families, you can't actually trace their lineage back before the year 800 AD? We've got some pretty solid records on these families between the 800s and the modern day, or whenever they were wiped out. But before 800, we don't really know where they came from. because we do have records in other places from before 800 AD, from the Middle East, India, China, even the Aztecs to a lesser extent. Even civilizations that existed in Europe but from a previous era, like the Greeks and the Romans, we've clearly got records from their time, but 800 AD is like a black hole. The natural first question is, what was going on in Europe around 800 AD? In order to really answer that, I'm going to have to pause this sidetrack and start a second sidetrack. I know, don't worry, it'll all make sense in the end. Have you ever heard a communist make the exclamation that they want to dismantle the nuclear family, or that they hate liberalism because of its individual rights, and that atomization is a cancer on the human race caused by capitalism? Because these are modern-day communists, they have no idea what they're saying or where they're getting it from. What they're talking about is what we call in the modern era modernization theory, though it didn't really have that name at the time. Karl Marx wrote about it in a paper titled Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, which is included in some versions of Capital. His communist partner in crime, Friedrich Engels, wrote about it in his book Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Both Marx and Engels believed that the ongoing modernization of the means of production during the Industrial Revolution destroyed the old tribalistic society of Europe, which revolved around extended families and their social hierarchies, otherwise known as the kinship family, as a necessary step of moving workers from the countryside and their fields into the cities and their factories. The preference for a smaller family structure, based on a mother and father and their direct children, known as the nuclear family, was therefore a direct result of economic development. In the Marxist view, the kinship family was replaced by the nuclear family as a part of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Both Marx and Engels interpreted these events as stepping stones towards the stateless, moneyless, classless communist society. When the productive forces of capitalism destroyed the feudal system, it also destroyed the kinship family as a consequence of that advancement. The liberation of the serfs from the economics of feudalism also meant their liberation from the kinship family. Marx and Engels believed the same thing would happen again. In their hypothesis, when the productive forces of communism destroy the capitalist system, it will also destroy the nuclear family as a consequence of that advancement. The liberation of the proletariat from the economics of capitalism also means their liberation from the nuclear family. This is why you can sometimes find modern communists who call the nuclear family oppressive and advocate for its abolishment, or why they sometimes describe parent and child the same way they describe owner and worker, as separate social classes with power imbalances between them, and that true equality can only be achieved when parents and children are equals, just as when owners and workers are. The issue here is that Marx and Engels were wrong. And I don't mean just wrong in terms of being communists and predicting that this process would happen again, a prediction that is spectacularly wrong. I mean, they were actually wrong about the initial process itself. The British anthropologist Jack Goody also served in the Second World War, and though he was captured in North Africa and held in a German prisoner of war camp for 3 years, he survived and returned to academia to enjoy an extensive publishing career in the second half of the 20th century. Goody summed up his multiple decades of study investigating the origins of the European family in the essay, The European Family, that's an apt name, and the information he provides directly contradicts communist assumptions about historical Europe's family structures. We know that since the 1400s, the number of women who worked in the workplace, or acquired their own property, or who chose to marry later than average, have all been higher in Western Europe than anywhere else in the world. These are all signs that Western Europe favored a nuclear family structure centuries before the Industrial Revolution. For example, in England, women had the legal rights to own property, sell chattel, work for themselves, and sue other people, all without needing the permission of a male head of the family since 1066. This implies that the nuclear family structure was imported to England by the Normans, again centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Across Western Europe, during the period of around 1000 AD to 1500 AD, we can see the development of the idea that land can be passed down from parent to child, that parents can disinherit their children if they so desired. We see written contracts between parent and child, obliging children to care for their parents in their old age. We see examples of children abandoning their parents if their parents acted unworthy of that care, or if their children were of low moral character. These are important bits of evidence, because this all flies in the face of the idea that feudal Europe had a tribal social structure, with a kinship family model. From what we know about prehistory tribal societies, they are governed by familial birthright. Land was held in common, and your tribe held that land by virtue of your ancestors having been buried on it. Tribes began as extended family relations, and were held together through custom and moral intuition. Children within a tribal society had a strict duty towards their elders, and women only ever gained rights within a tribal society by producing male heirs. The idea that one can sell land or property or labor doesn't exist within this form of social organization, nor is there any necessity for written contracts to exist between people who are within the same family. And yet, we have physical contracts dating from the feudal period of Western Europe, showing that it was not based around a kinship family structure, but instead the nuclear family. The idea that the Industrial Revolution created large urbanized productive centers, which tore the kinship family apart into the nuclear family, destroying cultures and social norms in the process, is just not true. It's part of a wider theory of history developed by and favored by socialists, who believe that class conflict is the only driver of history. But they're deeply wrong on a fundamental level. Capitalism did not destroy the kinship family. In fact, it was the prior destruction of the kinship family that partially led to the development of capitalism in the first place. So what was it that destroyed Europe's tribal structure? Two things: war and faith. And they both have a significant impact on the meritocratic conversation that, trust me, we haven't actually left behind. We'll get back to it. Let's talk about faith first. The earliest human religions were generally centered around ancestral worship and served to justify the existence of the tribal structure. Your ancestor was a god, therefore as the oldest male, you were the head of the tribe, and your descendants were below you in the hierarchy. The faith and the social order were one and the same. This state of affairs was appealed to favorably by Marx, who called it primitive communism, a label that isn't entirely without merit. As like I said before, tribal land was held in common, money didn't exist, and labor was compelled not through trade, but through tribal obligation and force. But again, Marx was incorrect in a key way. A tribal society was not classless, nor was it oriented around equality. In fact, the strict social hierarchy of the kinship family was the only thing at keeping the whole enterprise going. And the only class mobility in that society is waiting for your elders to die so you can take their spot. Considering that in the tribal society, once again, the faith and the social order were one and the same, it makes sense that across our history of contact between two civilizations at different levels of development, the organized religion of the more advanced society almost always disintegrates not only the tribal faith, but the social hierarchy of the less advanced civilization. Let me use an example. The Roman Empire was a larger, stronger, and more prosperous civilization than the Kingdom of Judea, and it's no surprise that the Jews were conquered and subjugated by the Romans around 60 BC. But the Roman religion was still, at its core, more tribal than organized, and Christianity was founded as a consequence of this specific dynamic: a larger, more powerful empire dominating a smaller ethnicity with their own faith and customs. One of the many reasons that the Roman Empire ultimately collapsed is considered by historians to be the spreading of Christianity within its borders, long after Christ's death, a religion that was born out of the conquered Jewish ethnicity, despite the relative strength of the Romans and the weakness of the Jews. Nietzsche described this process in his book on the genealogy of morality, specifically the part where he talks about the concepts of master morality and slave morality. Master morality is centered on nobility. No, we're not coming back to the original topic just yet. There's two definitions of noble. The first is belonging to a hereditary class with high social or political status, aka aristocratic. The second is having or showing fine personal qualities or high moral principles and ideals. Nietzsche is talking about the second definition. Master morality is defined by being a person of virtue, of good character. Nietzsche describes this as being strong-willed, powerful, courageous, heroic. He also admits that on some level, master morality has to be self-defined. On this topic, he wrote, "The noble type of man experiences itself as determining values. It does not need approval. It judges what is harmful to me is harmful in itself. It knows itself to be that which first accords honor to things. It is value-creating." To me, this sounds a bit like you know it when you see it, which seems a bit wishy-washy, but anybody who's ever embarked on a journey of enlightenment or self-actualization, yeah, it really is something you know when you see. I think that's why it's sometimes hard to describe virtue ethics. You've got to experience them first. No words really do it justice. Slave morality exists specifically in response to master morality. It's based on resentments, devaluing what the master values and what the slave lacks. Slave morality originates in the weak as a reaction to their oppression, as master morality originates in the strong and the oppressive. Slave morality doesn't intend to overcome master morality in conflict, but subvert it, making the masters into slaves as well, by convincing them that the weak could not help but be weak. In other words, when a slave morality holds up humility as a virtue, it is only because humility has been forced upon them by a master morality, and they've adopted it as virtuous because there is nothing else they could do. Additionally, the good is not simply what is good for the actualization of the self, but what is good for the whole community, the strong and weak alike. This universalizes the plight of the weak onto everybody, including the strong, which makes the strong into the weak. To really boil it down, slave morality is literally just cope. This describes exactly the story of the founding of Christianity. Roman morality was master morality, centered on willpower, courage, heroism. Judea was conquered by Rome. The Jews were a conquered people within the Roman Empire. It shouldn't be surprising that a conquered people and culture generated a new religion based on humility and mercy when confronted by an expanding militaristic empire based on strength and honor. And, as many historians have agreed, and Nietzsche himself theorized, it was the spread of Christianity within the Roman Empire that led to the Roman master morality eventually being usurped by the Christian slave morality. But something else also happened at the same time. Rome, despite being a huge empire controlling the Mediterranean Sea, also retained some important components of its pre-empire tribal roots. When you look at a society that has developed from a tribal structure and kept that structure intact, you can see it in the organization of their institutions. Despite being a settled people, the Roman family structure was still kinship, not nuclear. Extended familial connections ruled the day, and Roman nobility claimed to be descended from gods, like any other form of ancestral worship. During Rome's slow decline, the kinship family gradually withered away as people converted to Christianity. Nietzsche described Christianity as a form of proto-democracy. The Roman view, a tribal view, that noble families are descended from particular gods and therefore have more of a right to divinity than other people, is fundamentally incompatible with the Christian view that every human is inhabited by the same divinity, and therefore not only are they deserving of the same rights regardless of class, they are also all as close to a universalized God as anyone else. This is all a product of Christian slave morality striving for mercy in the face of Roman master morality. But it's also the seed of the Enlightenment project, as the Christian idea that we are all equal before God becomes the liberals, we are all equal before the law, becomes the socialists, we are all equal in ownership of the commons, becomes the fascists, we are all equal servants of the state. As a quick side point, this is one of the reasons why classical fascism isn't reactionary. They viewed themselves as the inheritors of the Enlightenment project. They don't like the liberals or the socialists, but they don't repudiate the entire superstructure of the Enlightenment. When you look at actual true reactionaries, like Mencius Moldbug or Julius Evola, they are significantly further to the right than somebody like Mussolini, because they reject the entire Enlightenment, socialism, liberalism, oftentimes even Christianity itself, as being slave morality that will inevitably tumble down the slippery slope of equality. They'd much rather have back the heroic pre-Christian master morality that Europe's tribal society was based on. This is why a lot of truly reactionary individuals are interested in pre-Christian European religions or philosophies, like Norse mythology or Apolloism, and also why a lot of reactionary Twitter accounts tend to focus on the aesthetics of European antiquity, generally starting with them having an avatar as a statue from Greece or Rome. Anyway, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the people who were once citizens of Rome and once participated in its culture and religious practices became overwhelmingly Christian. The old Roman concept of certain bloodlines being spiritually superior, and therefore socially superior, was gone in the face of Christian egalitarianism. Old Roman aristocratic families found that their authority was slowly undermined across many generations, as the adoption of Christianity saw their society begin to devalue the source of their legitimacy, their mythological descendancy from old Roman deities. Christian doctrine took a hardline stance against the marriage of widows, the marriage of relatives, adoption, and divorce, all of which were prevalent and even required for a society based on the kinship family to function. And now is when we finally get back to the mystery of 800 AD. After Rome's collapse, Western Europe spent several hundred years besieged on all sides, first by the Huns in the east, then the Muslims in the south, and the Vikings in the north. Peasants found themselves without the security that came with an extended tribal social order, which had already been eroded by Christianity in Western Europe, and was still very much intact in the societies of their invaders. As a result, warlordism was rampant in Western Europe, and the most successful warlords of that period of history that we now call the Dark Ages created a new European aristocratic class. Feudalism was created not as a result of economic forces, as a Marxist might claim, but instead out of warfare, wherein peasants would voluntarily submit to the authority of the owner of a castle and an army in exchange for his protection, an arrangement that became necessary after Christianity dissolved the extended tribal structure of Europe and its kinship family. But these new aristocrats, for the most part, weren't of noble blood. They didn't come from the old aristocratic families of Rome or any other kingdom. Instead, they were the people who were the most effective at defending their peasants from invaders, which is why you can't trace their bloodlines past 800 AD. They weren't old families, they appeared out of the chaos. All of this is to say that aristocracy and meritocracy are not two separate ideas, but rather a gradient of the same idea. While on paper the two concepts may be diametrically opposed in some theoretical sense, in reality they reinforce each other. The aristocrats of Western Europe after 800 AD certainly passed their lands and titles down to their descendants, making them aristocrats in the American sense. But they also earned their positions in combat by being the most effective warriors in an age of incredible hardship. Is that not a form of meritocracy? If the job that we're judging for is who can defend the people the most in the face of invasion, and the most successful warlords become Europe's new leaders, that certainly seems meritocratic to me. History is filled with examples like this, where the lines between aristocracy and meritocracy are blurred. Another example is the Papal States. Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, conquered a huge chunk of Italy and then gave it to the church as the donation of Pepin, a declaration of his piety. The Papal States function as an aristocracy, a land-owning institution with all of the rights and responsibilities of any other kingdom in its time, but it was an aristocracy without aristocrats. There was no bloodline that power was passed down in the Papal States. It was ruled by the Pope and governed by the Church, and becoming the Pope, or earning any station within the Church, is judged not on blood, but on faith. In a sense, it was a meritocracy if the merit that you're judging for is religious devotion. There is also a very strong argument, backed up by historical precedent, that meritocracy's natural endpoint is aristocracy, that the social forces unleashed by meritocracy during a period of rapid political change inevitably settles into aristocracy due to human nature. The most noteworthy example of this in action is the rise and fall of Venice. The Republic of Venice was founded in 810 AD, and by the 1400s, it was the largest and most prosperous city in Europe, off the back of its trade empire. The Venetians pioneered economic developments that would not be seen elsewhere for centuries, like the commenda. The commenda was an early form of economic investment, where a rich patron would supply the capital for a trade venture. A trader would conduct the venture, typically over the ocean, and upon his successful return, the initial capital would be returned to the patron, and the two would split the profits. The ratio of the split would be determined partially by how much capital the trader could also offer, and partially by how much legal responsibility the patron took on if the venture went south. Commenda jobs were the primary method of social advancement in Venice. Peasants in Western Europe found themselves bound within feudalism for their own protection, but any peasant in Venice could join a crew executing a commenda and earn a share of the capital for themselves. The Venetian archives tell us that the city was ruled by an early form of parliament, the Great Council of Venice. In theory, any free man could join the council, but in order for a person's candidacy to be put to a vote, they first had to be nominated by an elector, and the electors were chosen by lottery. Though the process was haphazard and not strictly codified, it was a truly open political institution, one of the earliest. Records of the council show that the body routinely saw newcomers, implying that Venice's open political and economic institutions allowed for a more meritocratic social structure to develop. New merchant families with no aristocratic background were continually established in Venice as a result of its meritocratic systems up until 1297, when the Serrata took place. The Serrata was a turning point in Venetian history. The councillors saw Venice's social mobility, a direct result of the meritocratic institutions, as a threat to their power. They passed a law making membership on the council a hereditary right. The council then used its power to cement the wealth and status of its current ruling class, locking out all of the up-and-comers that used to filter in and out of the elite class of Venetian society. The Venetian elites grew their wealth and power in the short term, no longer having to share with the young and capable of the next generation, but those young and capable revolted. As a result, the Venetian elites massively expanded police power to crack down on all political dissent, and then banned the commenda, the very thing that gave Venice its wealth in the first place, in order to stifle social mobility. They next nationalized Venice's trading companies and levied huge taxes on all the trade they didn't own. As a result, Venice rapidly declined in wealth, power, and population as workers and entrepreneurs left for greener pastures. And Venice began to lose its territory to the Ottoman Empire as early as 1416. The Republic of Venice remained a shadow of its former self, a puppet of the other European powers, until Napoleon did away with the charade and conquered it in 1797. Though it took over 100 years for the effects of the Serrata to begin Venice's decline, there is a solid through line between the Venetian elites dismantling their own meritocracy and the destruction of their society. We can also look at the Kingdom of Hungary for a similar example of meritocracy turning into aristocracy. Hungary was founded by King Stephen I in 972, who had a vision of it as a Catholic feudal kingdom in the style of Western Europe. The most effective warlords became the aristocracy, like in the other feudal systems, but the central authority of the king was significantly weaker than the other feudal kingdoms. The Golden Bull of 1222 was forced upon the king by the Hungarian nobility, and it was that country's Magna Carta, limiting the powers of the crown. But unlike the Magna Carta, the Golden Bull was signed by the king to placate the hereditary nobles in the face of a growing middle class, which was unusual for a feudal country. The king at the time of the Golden Bull, Andrew II, had a more meritocratic policy, at least for the time. He gave gifts of land and titles to effective and loyal servants, regardless of their bloodline, so much so that he single-handedly created a middle class of newly landed nobles. The old Hungarian nobility felt threatened by this new middle class, as did the church in Hungary, who also feared the king would redistribute their land as well. The Golden Bull secured the rights of the aristocracy by weakening the crown as a result. By the time the Ottoman Empire invaded, Hungary had a king in name only, having been reduced to a confederacy of corrupt nobles who provided no services or protection. During this era, the kingdom was protected by John Hunyadi. Hunyadi was a mid-level member of a Wallachian noble family, but he was also the greatest military commander and tactician in Hungary's history. Facing down the complete destruction of Hungary at the hands of the Ottomans, Hunyadi was named regent and protector of the state. He implemented a broad tax against the aristocracy, requiring them to provide both gold and men to the crown. He used this tax to create the Black Legion, Hungary's first professional military. Influence within the Black Legion came not from bloodline, but results on the battlefield. Hunyadi also had an open mind about new strategies and technology, employing military wagons in unconventional ways, as well as heavily utilizing the earliest firearms, at great expense. As a result of Hunyadi's leadership, the Black Legion was the only European fighting force that actually managed to halt Ottoman expansion. Hunyadi died of sickness during a siege, and his son Matthias was crowned king of Hungary as a result of his father's accomplishments, Matthias I. Though Matthias was not gifted in tactics like his father, he was inspired by reading about the life of Julius Caesar in his youth, and recognized the dire situation for what it was. He continued funding the Black Legion with heavy taxation and maintained its meritocratic essence, and as a result, it was the sole army responsible for keeping the Ottomans out of Europe for about 50 years. But the Hungarian nobles hated the Black Legion. They hated its success where their own conscription armies failed, and they hated that they were forced to pay for it out of their own coffers. When King Matthias died, rather than understanding the necessity of a centralized state and standing army, the Hungarian aristocracy recalled all of the individual men from the Black Legion, cut the taxes on themselves necessary to support it, and placed a puppet on the Hungarian throne. When the Ottomans finally invaded, they destroyed the remnants of the Black Legion, executed the puppet king, and conquered all of Hungary. Let's jump hemispheres and books over to A History of Chinese Civilization by Jacques Garnet. Again, don't pick this book up unless you love history. Like Bloch, Garnet's personal history isn't all that relevant to his work. He was born in French Algeria in 1921. He fought in World War II, and then enjoyed a distinguished career as a historian, becoming the authoritative source on Chinese history in the West. A consistent source of internal strife for China has been the struggle between two concepts, Confucianism and legalism. Confucianism came out of the writings of the philosopher Kong-Fu-Zi, and like the Roman tribal traditions that were scaled up to fit with the concept of empire, Confucianism is a codification of the tenets of ancient Chinese tribal faith and custom. On the other hand, Chinese legalism came out of the writings of the philosopher Han Fei-Zi, a philosophy of bureaucracy and realism, a theory of statecraft essential to the creation and maintenance of a unified Chinese empire. The Confucianists preferred to hand down land, wealth, and power based on bloodline, viewing it to be a moral duty to do so. The legalists preferred a more meritocratic approach, creating one of the most famous Chinese institutions in history, which still persists in a heavily modified form today, the imperial examination. Empire-wide testing for the best possible candidates to run the imperial bureaucracy circumvented family lineages. The tug-of-war between the Confucianists and the legalists persisted for thousands of years, with neither force truly winning out over the other for very long. When the empire was more Confucian-focused, it was more stable, but also significantly more corrupt. Entrenched families were far less effective rulers than the legalist bureaucracy. The rule of law was arbitrary and one-sided in favor of the families in charge, and the civil service, being filled with branch relatives of local noble families, ended up being entirely incapable of doing their jobs. When the empire was more legalist-focused, it was more efficient and productive, but it also had to spend significant resources rooting out sources of corruption, which in practical terms meant provincial governors destroying local dynasties by breaking apart families, redistributing their property, and assigning individuals to far-off posts. And this wasn't just done to the noble families, but to everyone, to try and prevent the creation of new noble families in the power vacuum. China's actually a pretty unique example in that it shows either method of determining elite status, aristocracy and meritocracy, can both be flawed. For example, the Tang dynasty was founded by a prominent noble family from northern China, and they ruled in the Confucianist style, appointing family to imperial positions regardless of merit. What they intended was good leadership that would spring from social harmony and family custom, but what they got were families at the royal court scheming and backstabbing in order to centralize their own power. A state of affairs which culminated in the notoriously bloody rule of the Empress Wu, who murdered the previous heir to the throne, murdered large swaths of the aristocracy, and then murdered anybody who spoke against her, from philosophers to merchants to state bureaucrats, until she was finally murdered herself. On the other hand, the Ming dynasty were strict legalists who cut out unnecessary bureaucracy within the state in an attempt to make it more efficient. The practice of using eunuchs within the state bureaucracy peaked during the Ming dynasty, the Ming emperors seeing the practice as the ideal way of preventing entrenched bloodlines from corrupting the meritocracy they were attempting to build. And to their credit, the eunuchs they chose were absolutely the best at what they did. One of the Ming emperors believed that the eunuchs would never actually betray him, as they had no reason to do so. They couldn't have a family of their own. So the eunuchs that were the most fit for the task were made the state's secret police, the Dongchang. The Dongcheng were used to spy on and punish aristocratic families who were using their station as a way to subvert the more meritocratic structures of the state in order to privilege their own family. But this institution was so effective at the job that their influence massively grew over a short period of time. They gained their own jails, soldiers, and legal and military command structure. The Dongcheng's power eventually dwarfed even the emperors, and they ran roughshod across the entire country unopposed until a rebellion toppled the Ming dynasty. In the first story, the Tang dynasty's aristocracy choked out any sort of proper state functioning, drowning the empire in corruption. In the second story, the Ming dynasty's meritocracy created a hyper-competent institution that outclassed the rest of the state so much it destabilized the empire. Let's use an example from America herself, why not? Thomas Jefferson's version of America was of a country of small businessmen, individual farmers, craftsmen, traders, landowners, who would run the economy in a decentralized way for their benefit. In other words, the libertarian Wild West wet dream. Jefferson named this class of people the natural aristocracy as opposed to Europe's artificial aristocracies, where the artificial aristocracies ruled by birthright, America's natural aristocracy ruled by ability. This is contrasted with John Adams' vision of America, who warned of the dangers of monopolization and how the rich could oppress the poor without any state involvement at all, rendering the Constitution impotent to safeguard the rights of the people. Jefferson's vision of the future of the United States won out when he beat Adams in the presidential race of 1800. But by the beginning of American industrialization, just 60 years later, Adams had been proven largely correct. While it's true that this period was a golden age of private business in America, it was also one of America's most corrupt periods, with increasingly powerful corporations monopolizing their markets and shutting out competition. Probably the most famous example from this period is the Big Four, railroad tycoons who funded the first transcontinental railroad in the United States, receiving huge kickbacks from the government in the process. One of the four became the governor of California, and a brother of another of the four was a justice on California's Supreme Court, both of whom used their offices to ensure that the money kept flowing and kept competition out of the market. The Big Four are widely considered to be the greatest grifters and robber barons in American history. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 would kick off the beginning of the end of this way of doing business in America, at least for a time. President Roosevelt would employ the Antitrust Act to break the monopolies of J.P. Morgan, the American Tobacco Company, and Rockefeller Oil. Due to the wording of the Sherman Antitrust Act, unions were considered cartels just as businesses were. Meanwhile, business owners realized that instead of creating a cartel, they could avoid regulation under the text of the act by simply merging their businesses. President Wilson passed the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 to close these loopholes and created the Federal Trade Commission with the intent of preventing the establishment of monopolies in order to keep economic competition thriving. The best bit about this story, at least for me personally, is that John Adams' most famous quote about the dangers of monopoly, the one that goes, "The aristocracy is always more sagacious than an assembly of the people collectively, or by representation, and always proves an overmatch in policy sooner or later. They are always more cunning too than a first magistrate, and always make of him a mere ceremony, unless he makes an alliance with the people to support him against them." What is the whole history of the wars of the barons but one demonstration of this truth? What are all the standing armies in Europe but another? These were all given to kings by the people to defend them against aristocracies. Yeah, that quote? That's from one of Adams's entries in the Federalist Papers titled Venice, which is his analysis of how the Serrata destroyed the Republic of Venice by closing its previously open economic institutions. So, I've devoted approximately half of this video to various historic examples of the practical overlap between meritocracy and aristocracy. Here's a list of facts that we can take from these examples. 1. Aristocracies are stable but stagnant, while meritocracies are unstable but productive. Too much stagnation leads to decay, but too much instability leads to collapse. Any opportunity for the more meritorious to succeed is accompanied by some type of instability, whether that's political instability or economic instability or social instability. Chaos is a ladder after all. Stability and opportunity are like freedom and equality, related yet ultimately opposing forces. 2. All aristocracies were born out of meritocracies. No matter how much an aristocrat might claim to be descended from God, he is on the throne because one of his ancestors earned that throne. That says nothing about his fitness, by the way, but it does speak to the fitness of his ancestor. 3. The natural endpoint of meritocracy is to calcify into aristocracy. In a Wild West environment of little overarching authority and opportunities aplenty, wins and losses will begin to stack up among the more meritorious and less meritorious actors. The additional resources and opportunities enjoyed by the winners can not only be used to fairly win the next round, but also to change the rules of the game to ensure their victory. Human nature inevitably tries to turn true meritocratic institutions into aristocratic ones. That third point is very important. Though it was known about for far longer than this, in the early 20th century it was first codified into a coherent political theory called the Iron Law of Oligarchy by Robert Michaels. Michaels was a German-born Italian immigrant and sociologist. He was a friend and student of the founder of sociology, Max Weber. Michaels was an intellectual of his era and became a socialist while teaching at the University of Marburg. He joined the Social Democratic Party of Germany and unsuccessfully ran for office in 1903. Michaels was kind of the Italian equivalent of a weeaboo, an Italophile, I guess. Despite being German, he loved Italian culture, and his work was often published in Italian as a result. It was this exposure of his work to Italian socialist intellectuals that landed him a professorship at the University of Turin in northern Italy, and upon immigrating to Italy in 1907, he joined the Italian Socialist Party. Michaels wrote his most famous work, Political Parties, in 1911. One of the most famous quotations from that work states, "Oligarchy depends on what we may term the psychology of organization itself. That is to say, upon the tactical and technical necessities which result from the consolidation of every disciplined political aggregate. Reduced to its most concise expression, the fundamental sociological law of political parties may be formulated in the following terms. It is organization which gives birth to the dominion of the elected over the electors, of the mandatories over the mandators, of the delegates over the delegators. Who says organization says oligarchy." In other words, Michaels believed that rule by an elite class was inevitable in any society or institution, no matter how democratic they claimed to be. He observed that any organization, once it reaches a certain size, can no longer function as a direct democracy, where every decision is made by referendum. After that size threshold had been passed, power within the organization will always get delegated to individuals within the group. Therefore, representative democracy instead of direct democracy, where the people vote on the representative makes the decisions. Michaels argues that representatives inevitably form an entrenched elite class, as the power gained from being a representative can also be used to control the free flow of information, or reward loyalty and punish detractors, or alter the organization's procedures. Even if the organization remains democratic, the power of the representative can be used to heavily influence the decisions made by the electorate. Michaels therefore believed the natural state of all human organization to be oligarchy, and attempts to democratically curtail the power of elites will almost always fail because, even if we discount the power the elites hold over the electorate, the cold hard truth is, your average voter just doesn't give a shit. Michaels came to this conclusion after his own experiences within the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the Italian Socialist Party, as well as his other experiences in trade unions and later in universities in which he studied and taught. What he witnessed in all of these diverse institutions was fundamentally the same thing each time. No matter what the function of the institution was, or its political leaning, or how democratic it professed itself to be, it was always dominated by its leaders. Bureaucratization and specialization as an organization grows requires the rise of a professional administrator class whose only function is to tend to the hierarchy's stability. This naturally leads to the routinization and rationalization of the use of authority within the organization. The end result of this process is that democracy and large-scale organization are fundamentally incompatible. The larger an organization, the more powerful and entrenched elite class, and any democratic elements are just a pretense that's used to legitimize power after the fact. At least, this was Michaels' view. By 1924, Robert Michaels had joined Mussolini's fascist party. Like many of the former socialist turned classical fascists of that era, Michaels believed that Mussolini's willingness to reject liberal democracy, party politics, and international capitalism, alongside his desire to incorporate everything into one singular structure, the fascist state, was the next step of social progress. Michaels believed that the universalization and equalization of the Enlightenment project would finally be realized once everyone and everything was subsumed within the living autonomous fascist state, the state with a moral direction, a doctrine that acted independently of any one human's will. To Michaels, the iron law of oligarchy was proof that modernity itself would eventually trend toward fascism as its final end, a common belief among Europe's left fascists of the time, and one that he held until his death in 1936. The iron law of oligarchy is, in my opinion, one of the most important political theories to come out of the first half of the 20th century. And though it's not true 100% of the time, it is definitely true a lot of the time. Anybody who's ever had to wade through a bunch of bullshit bureaucracy, whether that's something big like real political organization, or something small like your local homeowners association, or your union at work, or office politics, or your student council, you all know that this is true. You've experienced it yourself. The entrenched elite at the top of the hierarchy who, even if they got there democratically, used the power of their position to entrench their position rather than serve the people who put them there. The historic examples I've laid out today are real-life proof of the theory. The meritocratically chosen warlords of Western Europe decayed into a new, post-Roman aristocratic class. The meritocratically chosen councillors of the Great Council of Venice executed the Serrata and turned Venice into an aristocracy. The meritocratic institution that was the Hungarian Black Legion was destroyed by aristocratic meddling that could not accept its existence, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. The aristocracy under Empress Wu led to the most corrupt period in Chinese history, probably even including the modern day, and the near total destruction of Chinese legalist meritocracy. Looking at the question of this video, what is the nature of meritocracy? The iron law of oligarchy gives us one definitive answer. Meritocracy is simply a stepping stone on the way to aristocracy. But there are other answers we have to consider. The dumbest possibilities, in my opinion, come from the anarchists, who don't seem to understand the nature of power at all. The anarcho-capitalist view, small individual property owners without the oversight of a state, is Jefferson's vision on steroids, and given enough time, the more successful members of that society would centralize power. Without the police and a state and a social contract to protect property in the owner's absence, property owners would have to hire private security to guard their holdings. But that private security would be made up of people who, while on the job, could not guard their own property. A practical solution to this problem is to have the more successful property owners provide lodging as partial payment to the less successful people who have been hired as security. But at this point, you've simply recreated the feudal structure of a noble landowner and the serf who lives on the land. It's for this reason that a common criticism of Google and Amazon's employee housing, for example, is that it is anarcho-feudalism. The anarcho-communist view isn't better, by the way. In their view, all property would simply be held in common, with everybody owning everything as a collective. Everything would be disposable, replaceable, fungible. If anything ever needs deciding, simply hold a vote. Whenever the majority wants, the majority gets. But this is still subject to Michael's critique of democracy. Direct democracy cannot function past a certain size. If our world were one giant anarcho-communist mass, any efforts towards direct democracy would be so inefficient as to be useless. That only leaves representative democracy, which means elected officials, which means political blocs, which means entrenched oligarchy. This actually happened to the Soviet Union. The massively centralized authoritarian Soviet state was named after the Soviet, a type of direct democracy workers' council that first appeared in 1905. Though the initial Soviets were genuinely free and open political institutions, the practical demand of power required the transition to representative democracy, and the lack of oversight on that power saw its democratic elements rapidly disintegrate. It's for this reason that a common criticism of anarcho-communism is that it is a natural stepping stone towards state socialism. Thankfully, there are more intelligent and evidence-based critiques of the iron law of oligarchy that we can look at, beyond just anarchist cope. C.W. Casanelli wrote a paper in 1953, arguing that while Michael's iron law has a high degree of general credibility, the theory was inadequate and inconclusive. In 1966, the political scientist Dankwart Rustow, that's quite the name, described the iron law as brilliantly fallacious. Josiah Ober argues in his book, Democracy and Knowledge, that ancient Athens defied Michael's expectations. Athens was a large democracy, and yet it outperformed its more hierarchical rivals. The most relevant critique comes from the 2000 article, Breaking the Iron Law of Oligarchy: Union Revitalization in the American Labor Movement. They found that while the iron law of oligarchy is often true, it's not absolute. Established organizations are ruled by elites with their own interests, but they are nonetheless still open to change in accordance with the desires of their membership. In order to explain the next leg of the journey that we're currently going on, I'm going to have to go on yet another very lengthy side tangent. When it comes to getting and keeping political power, there are two opposing views: elite theory and selectorate theory. Elite theory posits that a small minority of people, consisting of members of the economic elite, as well as government policy planners, hold the most power in the state, and that their power is independent of democratic elections. Modern elite theory came out of Italy during the pre-Mussolini era. In fact, Michael's and his iron law of oligarchy form a cornerstone of it. Proponents of elite theory cite different possible causes for this state of affairs. Many agree with Michael's that any large-scale organization naturally requires an oligarchic elite class. The conservative political theorist James Burnham wrote in his book The Managerial Revolution about how modern liberal society separates ownership from control, as well as the creation of what he coined the managerial class, a group of people who own very little but are nonetheless empowered to control the property of other people, and due to their lack of ownership, they're not incentivized to use this power of control in the owner's best interest. This is known as the principal-agent problem, where a principal hires an agent to perform his will, but the agent also has his own natural self-interest, which may be in conflict with the interest of his principal. Professor Thomas Ferguson theorized in his book, Golden Rule, the investment theory of party competition, that the reason rule by elites is inevitable in the modern era is because modern political systems are so complex that the cost of actually being politically aware is very high. So high, in fact, that no average citizen will ever truly understand what the government is doing. Therefore, only people whose full-time job it is to understand politics, like politicians, or lobbyists, or the elites, will ever actually excel at politics. The alternate theory, selectorate theory, posits that three groups of people constrain the power of rulers. The first group, the residents, is made up of anybody who theoretically could have some influence over choosing the ruler. In a democracy, this would be the entire eligible voting population. The second group, the selectorate, is made up of anybody who in a practical sense does have influence in choosing the ruler. In a democracy, this would be the people who actually vote. The third group, the winning coalition, are the people whose support is required to become ruler. In a democracy, these would be eligible voters, who do actually vote, who end up voting for the eventual winner, especially if they're in battleground areas. The swing voter is significantly more valuable than the safe ideologue in selectorate theory, as the ideologue's support is already assured, while the swing voter must be rewarded, or told he'll be rewarded, for his vote. Selectorate theory also posits that the primary goal of any ruler is to remain in power, and that to do so, the ruler must be supported by the winning coalition. This is the same whether or not the state in question is authoritarian or democratic. In authoritarian states, the winning coalition tends to be small, only the top military officials, business moguls, and other bureaucrats, and their loyalty to the ruler is rewarded using private wealth. The moguls extract value from the country's natural resources. The treasury of the country is distributed to the bureaucrats and military officials, and the common people remain outside of this cycle of wealth to languish in poverty. In democracies, however, the winning coalition is very large, many different groups of people all with competing interests, and their loyalty is rewarded by the ruler using public wealth. Supporting corporations are rewarded with tax breaks and favorable public contracts. Supporting unions see their interests represented in legislation. Supporting lobbyist groups see their policy prescriptions prioritized, whether that's healthcare funding or gun rights or whatever it is. The only thing that's different is that while in authoritarian states, the common people are impoverished because they exist outside the cycle of wealth, and thus the ruler doesn't need to help them to secure his rule. In democratic states, the common people are the source of the cycle of wealth, and the ruler must consider their desires, or at least the desires of those segments of the population essential to his rule. A great book describing selectorate theory in detail is The Dictator's Handbook, or you could just watch that excellent CGP Grey video on it, Rules for Rulers. Don't watch it on your stream though, he is very copyright strike happy. He doesn't like that Twitch React meta. But there we go. Elite theory versus selectorate theory. Neither of them really scream power the people to me. Elite theory views power as always being top-down by its very nature, and that the average person cannot ever actually influence the system, only be influenced by it. Selectorate theory is a little bit more hopeful, in that while there will always be the rulers and the ruled at least have some hope of not living in shit, as long as the ruler depends on them to maintain his rule. And that is a state of affairs that can be created through policy. A study often cited by elite theorists in support of their idea that society is governed by an elite class independent of democratic accountability is Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. To TLDR it, since it's very long, the study shows that the chance any given policy will actually be implemented by an elected official goes up the more that policy is also advocated for by what the study calls the economic elite class. If poor voters vote for a politician because the politician promises to implement a policy, the chances of him actually implementing that policy is about 0%. If your average middle class voter votes for a politician because he promises to implement the policy, the chances of him implementing it rise to about 30%. And if the economic elites vote for a politician because he promises to implement the policy, the chance of him implementing it rises to about 65%. In other words, regardless of what politicians promise on the election trail and the reasons why people vote for them, the votes of poor people don't actually influence them. Elite theorists look at this and say clearly democracy is just a sham. People in charge do whatever they want, and the elections simply serve to justify the elites already in power. But it's not so simple. The study also goes into the influence of interest groups. In this instance, interest group refers not only to the lobbyists that corpos use to petition the government, but also unions, schools, community organizations, various progressive identity advocacy groups, single-issue movements like abortion groups or gun right groups. Basically, any form of mass organization independent of the economic elites are an interest group. And the study finds that if an interest group endorses a politician because that politician promises to implement the policy, the chance of him implementing it rises to about 65%, the same level of influence as the economic elites. There's two ways to interpret this data. The first is to recognize that interest groups are also hierarchical out of necessity. They have to be oligarchies with entrenched power structures, with elites of their own that have to manage their own positions of power within these structures. And they're subject to the same political forces as the politicians they're lobbying. In essence, they form a little elite class of their own in their own ecosystem. And rather than disproving the iron law of oligarchy, it's still definitely in effect. The other way to look at this data is to recognize that despite interest groups also being hierarchies with elites within them, they're still not part of the elite class at the very top of society. They may have internal power struggles, but they do at least sometimes tend to accurately represent the will of the people they speak for. For example, your average American gun owner might disagree on some specific stances the National Rifle Association takes up on certain topics. But when the chips are down, they tend to be pleased with the NRA's advocacy on their behalf to protect their Second Amendment rights. When the NRA's lobbying with the government produces policy favorable to their goals, the individual gun owners who might have those small squabbles with the NRA still nonetheless see it as a victory. Compare that with the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation Network, which funneled millions of dollars of donations into the pockets of its founders. Do you think the average black person that organization claims to represent views their behavior as a victory? I don't think so. The data shows that interest groups have just as much influence on politics as economic elites do, and insofar as an interest group accurately represents the will of its membership, then those people have just as much clout in democratic politics as the elites do. Now, it's not guaranteed that an interest group accurately represents the will of its membership, that's obvious, but it certainly happens often enough, from the NRA to Planned Parenthood, to unions sometimes, to veterans associations, to the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, to Greenpeace, to the suffragettes, whatever. Regardless of whether or not you agree with the politics of these groups, they have a lot of political influence. And since their goals are more or less aligned with the goals of their members, those members also have a lot of political influence. Furthermore, when an interest group and its membership become unaligned in their goals, you often see the disintegration of the group, though that process takes some time. Another example beyond the BLM one is the slow collapse of the ACLU, as it abandoned its once stalwart free speech stance in favor of progressive activism. The study's conclusion appears, at first glance, to support the elite theorist view of power. A striking finding of the study is the nearly total failure of the median voter and other majoritarian electoral democracy theories. When the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Failure of theories of majoritarian electoral democracy is all the more striking because it goes against the likely effects and limitations of our data. The preferences of ordinary citizens were measured more directly than our other independent variables, yet they are estimated to have the least effect. In other words, what the disorganized average voter wants has little to no impact on what the government does, even in a democracy. Nor do organized interest groups substitute for direct citizen influence by embodying the citizen's will and ensuring that their wishes prevail in the fashion postulated by theories of majoritarian pluralism. Interest groups do have substantial independent impacts on policy, and a few groups, particularly the unions, represent average citizens' views reasonably well, but the interest group system as a whole doesn't. Overall, net interest group alignments are not significantly related to the preferences of average citizens. In other words, when interest groups do represent the will of the common person has their preferred policies put into place by government more often. However, most interest groups don't consistently represent the will of the common person. There is a bit of hope here for the average person, though. The preferences of economic elites have far more independent impact upon policy change than the preferences of average citizens do. To be sure, this does not mean that ordinary citizens always lose out. They fairly often get the policies they favor, but only because those policies also happen to be preferred by the economically elite citizens who wield actual influence. In other words, the average person gets what they want out of the government when it also just so happens to be the same thing that the elites want. This lines up with a lot of things we looked at today. Nietzsche's heroic master morality versus universalized slave morality, where appealing to mercy turns masters into slaves. Selectorate theory, where as long as the common people are included in the cycle of wealth generation, they will reap the benefit of supporting their ruler. When incentives are such that the interests of the common person are aligned with the interests of the elites, both the common person and the elites benefit. When those interests become unaligned over time, the elites win and the commoners lose, like with the decline of Venice or the American Big Four. What this says to me is that the best way for the common people to succeed is if their interest and the interests of the elite are aligned as much as possible. And this can be done through cultural influences where effective and public policy where necessary. And then, despite this study being favored by elite theorists, it delivers what I think is a serious blow to elite theory. Our findings speak most directly to the first face of power, the ability of actors to shape policy outcomes on contested issues. But they also reflect, to some degree, the second face of power, the ability to shape the agenda of issues that policymakers consider. Our results speak less clearly to the third face of power, the ability of elites to shape the public's preferences. A core part of elite theory is that not only do elites rule independent of democratic control, but that in democracies, voting is simply a method by which the elites post hoc justify their rule. Right-wing political YouTubers who are big proponents of elite theory, like Academic Agent for example, he often words this effect as something like, law isn't downstream from culture, culture is downstream from law. Things aren't legalized after culture changes. The elites change law, and culture adapts accordingly. Elite theory posits that not only do elites rule independent of democratic approval, but that the source of any democratic approval that might exist is simply the effect of elite power on the electorate. But that doesn't seem to be true. At least not consistently enough for it to matter. So, why am I bringing all this up? This video isn't about elite theory versus selectorate theory, it's about aristocracy versus meritocracy. Well, because there's a lot of overlap here too. The elite class envisioned by a lot of elite theorists is often an aristocratic class, and selectorate theorists often view their ideal society as a democracy with as broad a winning coalition as possible, where becoming both a ruler and a key supporter within the winning coalition is a result of climbing a meritocratic hierarchy. Of course, it's not always this way. Selectorate theory applies to aristocracy as well. And, for example, the classical fascists were all about abolishing social class and replacing them with the state apparatus, making them a strange form of authoritarian meritocracy. But that is one too many rabbit holes for this video. It'll have to come next time. Let's rewind all the way back to the beginning, to the Sitch and Adam conversation. Here's a reminder of how that went.
Aristocracy or meritocracy?
It's pretty
Which
quick,
is better?
Pretty quick.
I'm not sure there's a difference, to be honest.
With this in mind, let's take a second look at that list of 3 historical facts about the practical overlap between aristocracy and meritocracy. That aristocracies tend to be stable but stagnant, while meritocracies tend to be unstable but productive. That all aristocracies are born out of meritocracies, and that meritocracies naturally trend towards aristocracy over time. It makes sense that somebody like Sargon, who's not from America but the UK, would say that aristocracy and meritocracy are the same thing. In the moment, in some short time frame, like a decade or two, that's short in the civilizational scale, meritocracy and aristocracy look like completely different concepts. But if we're talking about hundreds or thousands of years, the age of the countries of the old world, these don't look like different concepts, but rather different stages along the same path of development. Here, let me ask 2 pretty complicated questions. 1. If a meritocratic institution is one where its apex is determined by ability alone, and some abilities are passed down as traits through families, then would that meritocratic institution not also be aristocratic? Let's use sports as an example, since it's probably the easiest one. What portion of elite performance at the highest level of a sport is genetic? While it's true that we look up to the once-in-a-generation sports superstars because of their incredible amounts of hard work and dedication, but surely there's a genetic component to this. One study that I could find points to 77 endurance-related genetic markers and 43 strength-related genetic markers shared among elite athletes. If these markers are passed on, do the children of pro-athlete parents have an advantage in becoming pro-athletes themselves? Considering how often it happens, the answer might be yes. Therefore, if sports are meritocratic, judging by ability at the sport, and ability is partially passed down through blood, surely sports also must be aristocratic. Question 2. If an aristocratic institution exists because its apex is determined by birthright, and as a result, the access to education and resources afforded to the children of aristocrats actually leads them to having the most ability, then would that aristocratic institution not also be meritocratic? Consider sports again. Think about what kind of opportunities are afforded to the children of pro athletes. Stuff that's not afforded to other people as a result of the wealth and influence of the parent. If those children have access to higher quality food, or better education or superior training than your average person does, could that not also lead to them having superior ability, especially if you pair that with the genetic influences? If aristocracy comes with it access to superior resources, and those resources create people with superior ability, surely that also makes it meritocratic. In this view, meritocracy and aristocracy are not enemies, but friendly rivals that perpetuate each other. They're like 2 interlocking cogs, each coordinating with and moving the other. The superior ability of those who rise to the top in a meritocracy grants with it the power to establish aristocracy, and the superior influence of the aristocracy creates people with superior ability who can rise to the top in a meritocracy. I think, despite the very anti-aristocratic nature of American culture, they still nonetheless intuit out the relationship between aristocracy and meritocracy as not opposing forces, but related ones. That's why they have the concept of old money versus new money. In fact, Jefferson's natural aristocracy referred specifically to the types of common men that, through their own hard work and skill, created today's powerful American families. How even though they were not old Europe's aristocrats of blood, they were nonetheless elites in their own right, and their merit would found dynasties. Jefferson was correct. However, John Adams' response to Jefferson is equally correct. He wrote, "Birth and wealth are conferred on some men, as imperiously by nature, as genius, strength, or beauty. The heir to honors and riches and power has often no more merit in procuring these advantages than he has in obtaining a handsome face or an elegant figure. When aristocracies are established by human laws, and honor, wealth, and power are made hereditary by political institutions, then I acknowledge artificial aristocracy to commence. But this never commences until corruption in elections becomes dominant. This artificial aristocracy can never last. The everlasting envies, jealousies, rivalries, and quarrels among them, their cruel rapacities upon the poor ignorant people, their followers compel these to set up a Caesar, a demagogue to be a monarch and master. Here you have the origin of all artificial aristocracy, which is the origin of all monarchy. And both artificial aristocracy and monarchy and civil, military, political, and hierarchical despotism have all grown out of the natural aristocracy of virtues and talents. We, to be sure, are far remote from this. Many hundred years must roll away before we shall be corrupted. While Jefferson accurately pointed out that America would prosper if its best people were free to thrive regardless of social class, Adams accurately pointed out that you couldn't simply set and forget the state of affairs. The freedom would have to continually be reinforced through policy. The game board would regularly have to be reset in order to prevent stagnation and generate opportunity for new players. The many examples I've shown you today prove Jefferson to be correct about the beginning of meritocracy and Adams to be correct about its endpoint. The Kennedys, the Clintons, the Bushes, the Trumps, these were not considered elite families if you go back, say, 10 generations. But the meritocratic success of the patriarchs of these families have created an informal American aristocracy. And yet, the current generation of those families still have their own accomplishments under their belts. They are aristocratic, but they're also kind of meritocratic too. This is the main reason why socialists hate meritocracy, by the way. They view people climbing the hierarchy based on merit as people still climbing hierarchy, and a truly equal society would have no hierarchy at all. The issue is, they're kind of correct, but you know what? That's a good thing. It is good that some people are better than other people at some things. And if that means that we're not equal, okay. So, what do we do about all this? What's the solution? A great place to start is Adrian Woolridge's book, The Aristocracy of Talent. Woolridge decries the aristocracies of the pre-industrial era, where exceptionally gifted individuals still ended up as serfs because their parents were serfs. But he also points out that from the eunuchs in China to Plato's Republic of the Men of Gold, where children would be taken from their parents by the state and educated to be moral citizens, every scheme ever devised by human minds to be purely meritocratic necessarily must oppose the family, as family members tend to privilege each other by virtue of being family. Ability be damned. Woolridge is still ultimately pro-meritocracy, as am I, but he understands its tendencies and limits. Leftists view meritocracy as a destabilizing force, leaving only crumbs for the less meritorious. Do that enough and you'll have a peasant revolt on your hands. Rightists view meritocracy as a tool of global capital, experts at the top of the meritocratic hierarchy promoting forever wars in the Middle East, and the destruction of the American job market in the pursuit of the most efficient, most productive economy. These are critiques of meritocracy that can't simply be ignored. For meritocracy to truly function long-term and not simply calcify, the people at the top of the hierarchy must accept that they have a moral duty towards the people at the bottom of it. They cannot simply pull up the ladder behind them, blocking new competition, nor can they exploit the less meritorious, taking advantage of their failures. If social responsibility doesn't come with victory, if a ruler cannot rule with grace, then any meritocracy will inevitably fail, as meritocracy has no mechanism within itself to prevent this failure. After all, the more meritorious won. Why shouldn't they reap the rewards of being at the top? Nothing's stopping the less meritorious from climbing the ranks but themselves. It's only fair and natural that they remain on the bottom. You can see how a meritocratic attitude leads to aristocracy pretty quick, in the absence of a sense of duty towards the lower class. Even before the concept of meritocracy existed, people had an intuition this was the case. That's why the word noble refers to both an aristocratic person and a person who behaves in a virtuous manner. A noble who acted nobly understood his responsibility to those below him. His serfs were bound to work for him, but he was bound to protect them in turn. Duty kept them both in line. He did not simply enrich himself at the expense of his peasants. Now, were all aristocrats noble nobles? Of course not. Many of them were ignoble nobles. But history has properly judged the good from the bad, because we know the difference, and we recognize a failure to fulfill obligations when we see it. Meritocracy functions the same way. Yeah, you can't appeal to a code of honor, you can't appeal to God or country or the social hierarchy, but there is something like the spirit of competition. Win with grace, lose with dignity, that sort of thing. There's an understanding that whether it's aristocracy or meritocracy, the people at the top of the hierarchy must fulfill their duties towards the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, or the system tilts towards tyranny. A tyrannical meritocrat behaves the same way towards the lower class as a tyrannical aristocrat does. And in the same vein, an honorable aristocrat and an honorable meritocrat have much in common. Yeah, Bill Gates gets a lot of hate right now, and it's not entirely undeserved. But man, that guy took his fortune and decided he was going to try and wipe out malaria with it. If that's not giving back to humanity, I don't know what is. The more we go over all of this stuff, the more overlap there is between meritocracy and aristocracy. The reason for that, by the way, is plutocracy. If aristocracy is ruled by blood and meritocracy is ruled by ability, then plutocracy is ruled by money. The richest people in the world are either old money coming from old rich families or new money getting rich themselves, and the most capable of the new money become old money eventually. In a liberal capitalist democracy like America, money is both a sign of ability and a sign of social class. A rich person may be rich by inheriting his wealth. He may be rich by earning his own way there, and oftentimes he's rich because of both. Plutocracy is the missing link between aristocracy and meritocracy. As I've said many times in this video, I still think that rule by merit is the way to go. The best person for the job is the person with the most ability. But I'm not going to be a blind ideologue about it. Meritocracy comes with many setbacks that must be accounted for. It's an inherently destabilizing social force, going against our natural impulse to privilege those close to us. And preventing people from doing so too much tends to ruin things. It can also be used to simply recreate an aristocracy again, if the most meritorious among us decide to pull up the ladder behind them. And if there's no common culture and kinship between those at the bottom and those at the top, if there is no sense of duty that the elites hold towards the common person, then meritocracy is just as exploitative as aristocracy. Our society should be meritocratic, but if it doesn't also account for meritocracy's natural pitfalls, then there's just no point. It ends up being just as bad as all the other alternatives. Alright my friends, that's the end of the video. This one took me a very, very long time to do. Lots of reading, lots of editing, lots of thinking. So, if you liked the video, please consider supporting me. I'm on Patreon, I'm on Subscribestar. If you're watching this as it premieres, you can super chat. If not, you can hit the YouTube memberships button or the sub button over on my Twitch channel. And if you can't afford any of that, that's completely fine. I'm just happy you watched. Please consider sharing the video around on social media. I think I'll take a short break after this because I predict this one was going to ruin me in the editing process. So maybe I need a day or two off. And as always, I really appreciate you guys coming by and listening to me ramble about this stuff. I think that about does it for me. I will see you guys next time. I love you. Oh, also, if you're a viewer of Adam and Sitch, go over to their channel right now and flood them with comments about doing more Marvin Yarvin streams. Adam doesn't want to do it anymore. We gotta make him do it.